We are right in the middle of the 9th chapter. And so, I think we're on text 14, if I'm not mistaken. You know, it's interesting, but if you look at text 12, if we look at the, I guess if we could just recap the 9th chapter so far. Maybe don't look at text 12 just yet. Krishna starts off in kind of a formulaic way, a pretty standard way. He defines what he's going to be teaching. He tells you what the result is. This one is moksha se ashubha. It'll liberate you from inauspicious things. He tells you what your credentials are, that you need to have faith. Faith in Just to recap again, there's a standard thing called a chatushtaya, which are 4 things that get listed at the beginning of a Sanskrit text. And they define your subject matter, they define the qualifications you need to have to be able to study it. They tell you kind of what the goal is, what you get from studying the text, etc., etc. So in the chapters of the Gita, you often find that those opening stanzas of a chapter do the same thing that you'd see in a traditional Vedic text. And so in this chapter especially, but also in many other chapters, Krishna tells you what he's going to be teaching you. And so this one is Raja Vidya, it's the knowledge of kings. Raja Guhya, it's the king of all secrets. Pavitram, it's purifying. So like he goes through it like Pratyakshavagamam, it gives direct perception. It's dharmya, it's spiritual. Sukham kartum, it's joyfully performed. It's uttama, it's the supreme. So he tells you, he glorifies the information and tells you about it. Then he tells you what you're going to get. You're going to get liberation from it. Then he tells you what your qualifications are. You need to have faith. And faith is, at least in Western religion, it becomes this sort of enigmatic boogeyman. Like you have faith. There's a statement from the Bible, faith is trust in things yet unseen. But you're sort of left with this idea that faith is just this thing. You have it. Like, cats. 2/3 of cats like catnip. They just freak out about it. Do you guys know what catnip is? It's like a flowering shrub or something like that grows in different places of the world. And cats smell it and get intoxicated off it. It's a weird thing. Other animals too. It happens with tigers and lions as well. They get all excited about catnip and they rub up against it and roll around their backs and then get kind of sedated. Have you ever seen a cat interacting with catnip? It's bizarre. It's like they're trying to make love to the catnip, and then they're also at the same time getting drunk on the catnip. It's really weird. Then they have this olfactory fatigue which sets in, and things kind of go back to normal at a certain point. But when they first hit it, now there's some cats that just are not susceptible to catnip. Sometimes valerian works for them, but some cats just don't. They don't. Like some people hate cilantro. What a horrible, birth to take. Where you hate cilantro, Yeah. Some people don't like pineapple on pizza, like these weird freaks of nature who don't like pineapple on pizza. And so you get these things, like in culture, just kind of things. It's like a tomato type thing. And so some cats really like catnip and other cats don't. I feel like the way faith is defined in the West, it has this sort of there's nothing you can do, and it just kind of happens, and it's not logic. In fact, faith oftentimes is contrasted with logic or reason be on one side, and faith and belief would be on the other side. You get this polarization of these two concepts, such that if you are logical and if you are reasonable, then by definition you don't have faith. I'm unwilling to concede that idea. I'm not. It seems like all of Christianity has kind of gone down this road. Like 99% of Christians have gone down this road. So it's almost somewhere between like around 40% of the world's population. Hey, if you take notes, it's like it's not working. It's not going to happen. You're going to be a scribe. You're not going to learn. Take your notes, and you could teach somebody, like you could like give them to somebody, or maybe you could read them and learn, but my suspicion is you're going to learn better by listening. I'm unwilling to concede that you have to be illogical and unreasonable in order to have faith. I don't know why 40% of the world's population's gone down that road. And so it certainly isn't what led me to my spirituality. I find I'm more reasonable and more logical than I've ever been. And I think that the very idea of logos was linked to God in the Bible. There's that famous statement in the book of John. The beginning was the logos, and logos was theos. This whole idea of logic being synonymous with God, or something participated in God's nature when it was logical and it was reasonable. All the ancient Greeks, they were spiritualists, and they were also mathematicians or doctors or logicians. And there wasn't any sense that you had to give one up in order to achieve the other. So there's this idea of like faith has really become synonymous with blind acceptance or blind belief. You follow? I mean, there's a reason for this. René Descartes came up with this thing called dualism. He's so famous for it. It's called Cartesian dualism because he was the one who first popularized it. I mean, it's obviously Sankhya taught dualism literally thousands of years prior. And it's written. But anyway, in Western philosophy, René Descartes, he conceived that the world was being made out of, there was a phenomenal world, which is the world of stuff, and then there was the numinous world, the world of numen, from nous, which means the world of mind. And so you have the world of mind and the world of stuff. One of the reasons he did that was because nobody could figure out how to mechanically explain consciousness. Consciousness, hundreds of years ago, during the Renaissance period, was this really difficult thing to account for. The world was like growing. The Industrial Revolution was we were just right about there. And huge advancements in anatomy and physiology. The world was opening up in a lot of ways to science and scientific investigation. But there was this massive problem we still had, which was namely that nobody could figure out how to make the mind derivative of matter. Nobody could explain how the mind and the matter were really the same substance. Nobody could come up with a grand universal theory that accounted for mind and matter. And so what Descartes really did was he said, let's just throw mind into another bucket over here. And let's not worry about it. And that'll free us up to do science, to do mechanistic physicalist science. And let's see how far we can take it. there's been really like no improvement in terms of figuring out how consciousness arises. It's still just tucked away in the corner. There's still insuperable problems. Like, how do we have free will? Where do chemicals demonstrate the evolution of free will? You can invoke things like emergence, but emergence only refers to physical phenomena. We don't find anything in terms of emergence, in terms of consciousness, that we can compare it to. And it seems like an insuperable problem, because even to measure things and to divide things into different categories, you have to be conscious a priori. It's almost like consciousness is the most irreducible facet of reality, because reality, even from an instrumentalist point of view, where you're looking at the world through different lenses, only has meaning if you're conscious and you can choose which lens to look through the world. I don't want to get too much into this today because I want to get back into the text. But chemicals don't have thoughts about other chemicals. We've not traced out how consciousness arises in the brain. We found some correlates. We found some ways in which consciousness is related to certain brain functions. But that's much different than demonstrating causation. And largely, if you read like current literature on philosophy of mind, they just still throw consciousness over in the corner and say, well, as long as we can explain physical properties, that's enough. You can ignore it's this, troublesome, thorny, inconvenient thing that we hope will just go away in due course of time. This is in 2021. 300-400 years later. So, I think faith kind of went down that road. I think that's actually where it probably turned. It used to be that people were reasonable and logical, and the best philosophers and mathematicians actually believed in divinity. But I think you can trace out the separation, and you can trace it to René Descartes. And he just didn't want to deal with the mind anymore because it was too troublesome, and he threw it away. And really, that's kind of what's still going on now. Huge advancements. But in terms of a grand universal theory that ties all together, not so much. And this has led to what in the modern day, in the last 20, 30 years, as people begun to get called out on this, has become known as the hard problem of consciousness. Why there's something that's like to be conscious. Why the universe in many ways is inherently subjective. Science is good for studying things objectively and measuring things. You could say how wide this table is. Yeah, and whoever you are, we can look at it and we can repeat the experiment. And you don't have to have any faith, and we can just demonstrate it to anybody. It's like done like in the third person. Consciousness is unusual in that it's real, it exists. There's no way to really doubt it because you have to be conscious in order to doubt it. That's why I was saying it's the most irreducible feature of reality. But it's inherently only accessible in the first person. I can't really know what it's like to be you. I can't even really know you're conscious. All I can do is notice that you respond to stimuli in the same way I do. I call your name and you answer. And that's the way I answer when you call my name. And so analogously, because I know I'm conscious, I assume you must be conscious like me. But there's no way to actually prove it objectively. Such a fundamental feature of reality, and it can't be proven objectively. But science is all about objectivity, but how does it study something which exists, which is undeniable, but which is inherently subjective? One way to do it is you just say, look, let's just explain the behaviors. You move your arm like that, that's caused by these neural synapses and what have you, and that's enough. But those neural synapses could very easily be going on in a dark room without anybody being conscious. Why are we conscious? Chemicals seem to respond just fine to stimuli without it necessarily being that they have to be conscious. Why are we conscious? Why is there something it's like to be you? Why does the world feel the way it does? Why do we have thoughts about other people? Why do we have free will? Why do these things seem to be the most basic aspects of our existence that really have to exist before anything else has any meaning? And so it's tempting to just want to explain the physical world and think you've done your work, but it's not really fair, because there's something that you can point to that you know exists, namely your own consciousness. The fact that it's thorny and difficult to define and it resists traditional scientific models for testing doesn't make it any less real. It just means you have to revise those systems and see them as incomplete, and you have to develop a new science which is capable of interfacing with consciousness. And in fact, there's attempts to do this. Phenomenology is an attempt to do this. Anyway, there's all sorts of attempts to revise what we think of as being scientific. So that's where I think it went wrong, like historically. And Krishna here is saying you have to have faith. Faith is shraddha, it's to place your trust in something. And I don't think it's possible to really follow a teaching or follow an experiment without having some initial faith. Like theories, you're not really a theory until you've done some testing. For something to be called a theory, it has to have been tested. It's not, necessarily, it's been tested enough where it's impossible to believe something else. But for something to become called a theory, it's not that you came up with it, like, I think you're an alien. That's not a theory. That's just me saying something. Theories have evidence behind them. They have been tested to some extent. There may be certain limitations on how you can test. Like, for instance, the origin of life or the origin of the universe. There might be a limitation in how rigorously you can test that. So you come up with a theory. Prior to a theory, it's a hypothesis. But even hypotheses have to be reasonable and non-contradictory in order to get people to go in the laboratory and study them. We would call that interest, that bona fide, which literally means good faith. If something's bona fide, it means it's accepted in good faith. It's passed some initial tests and you can accept it. And so you require faith to go to college and listen to a professor, to learn a language from somebody else who ostensibly knows that language. Like oftentimes, I'll struggle with a Spanish word or something like that, distinguishing between querer and amor, right? Between like lust and love in Spanish. So I'll look at somebody who's a native Spanish speaker and I'll double check what I'm saying with them. How do I know that they actually know what they're talking about? You follow? But I'm not just blindly. They look Mexican or Latina, and I've listened to them speak Spanish, and I know their history. I know they're from Mexico. At least they told me they are. I don't know. They could be lying to me. You're from Mexico? Liv might be from Iran, and she just faked a really good Spanish accent, and for whatever reason has come up with this story. I mean, it's not like she couldn't be Iranian. You know what I mean? I don't know. I never studied. I didn't force her to give me a DNA sample that I could then test in a laboratory to verify who she is. To move forward in life, you take a few chances, but that doesn't mean that you have no logic or no reason for believing what you do, or no reason for testing a hypothesis, or no reason for moving from that testing into an actual theory. You walk into a college classroom, you take it for granted that the teacher who walks in and begins teaching knows what he's doing. There's a book called Catch Me If You Can. It got turned into a movie. But before it was a movie, it was a book. It's the whole thing. If you read the book, then you think the movie's garbage. Otherwise, the person who says it was a book before, they just seem like a snob. if all you ever saw was the movie, and people are like, oh, the book's much better. In this case, I happen to read the book, and so the movie's garbage, the book's fantastic. Anyway, the guy actually, I'm being a snob, but whatever, I read the book, so I get to do that. The guy actually pretended to be a doctor. He just decided to fake it. Didn't even have like a college education at all, and just faked it in the 60s. He was a doctor, and went and was a doctor at a hospital, and treated patients. And there were the interns working under him who had actually gone to medical school. He'd be like, "What do you think?" And they'd say this. He'd go, "Good. All right, let's do that. Any other opinions? All right, let's go with that." And I saw a mentalist, which is a really smart guy who manipulates people, play chess against 10 masters simultaneously. And he was asked, but grandmasters, not masters, grandmasters, the top guys in the world. And he was asked, they were all asked, "What do you think of this guy?" And they're like, "He's one of the best chess players I've ever played before." The fact that he can play 10 of us at this level is just insane. What happened was he started 5 games, and he went second in 5 games. So what he did was he would take these moves of these 5 guys and then do the exact same opener for these 5 guys. Then they would respond, and he would take the response and play it against these 5 guys. You follow? So really, he was just acting as the liaison for 10 grandmasters to play each other in 5 games. And all these brilliant guys were too stupid to figure out that's what was happening. No one did that math to notice that all the games were, there was 5 games, and it was double carbon copy. You follow? Nobody figured that out. I don't know how I got into Catch Me If You Can. I'm totally bewildered. I went too far down the rabbit hole. Yeah, and actually you can get cheated. That's an example of you being cheated in such a circumstance. You go into a hospital and the guy is actually a con man. So it's not 100%. So Krishna's made a point here. I'm going to teach you this thing. He's tried to earn our trust over 8 chapters. And he's saying if you want to be successful in this, you have to have faith. And really, honestly, if you want to test something and really find out whether it's true or not, you have to at least have enough interest to sincerely conduct the experiment so that you're not guilty of confirmation bias. You guys know what confirmation bias is? People find evidence that they want to find to support pre-existing notions they have about what's true. And if they find evidence which goes against what they believe, they generally just think it's not as important. And the evidence that supports what they want to believe, they'll think that evidence is more important. Do you follow that? They've done extensive testing on this. They've given the same evidence to people on different sides of issues. And those people, the party who's on this side will say that evidence is more important, that supports my point of view, and that other evidence is so far. And the other guy will say this other evidence is more important, and if they just give the other person, if they don't give you both evidences, if they just give you one, you'll be changed. Your mind will be changed. But when they give you this other piece of evidence, even if it's weaker evidence, you'll glom onto this, stick to your guns, and dismiss the evidence that would have convinced you if it had been presented on its own. It's a whole field of how people have these knowledge filters that affect what they believe. I mean, they even had guys in the military, and they put them into a situation, like a war game situation, and they started giving them evidence that the choices they'd made were costing hundreds of thousands of lives, and they colossally failed. And the guys would not give up. They just kept going down the same road because they couldn't bear to admit that they'd made a mistake. And they cost all these lives. And so when the evidence came that they were making a mistake, they just stuck to their guns. Generals. In contrast, they would take the same generals, put them into a situation, and not have them commit any troops to anything. Then they would give the information, and they would make the right choice. But once they made a decision, they were willing to filter out, at the cost of lives, their bad, the evidence against them, just to keep going down the path and not admit they made a mistake. You guys following this? You require some degree of openness, some degree of receptivity in order to be able to find something, even if it's true. I mean, like I inevitably, I always read both sides of any issue I study. I find the best arguments for something, the best arguments against something, and I read both. And it's painful. Because when you're a novice and you're delving into a new field and you read arguments for one side, you're convinced. Then you read arguments for the other side and you're convinced, and then you're bewildered because it makes you question everything you read on the first side. And you got to spend time. You got to like dive into it and become a little bit expert to have an educated opinion that won't just be swayed. Or you just commit yourself to a position and kind of shut your eyes and turn on the blinders and just refuse to accept any evidence to the contrary, which is what most people do. So Krishna's request that we have faith, I don't see any reason to assume that faith means blind faith, that faith means no reason, that faith means no logic, that faith means no good, perfunctory evidence to support you going down this road and trying something out and doing an experiment. I'm for logical faith. I'm for reasonable faith. I'm for earned faith. Now, maybe you want to use a different word because the word faith has been spoiled, like the word religion and the word God. People can't use it anymore. They got to figure out other words to use. Euphemisms, because these words sound too Christian and Muslim for people. So then you can call it interest, or curiosity, or trust, or desire to experiment, or desire to understand. You can call it whatever you want to call it. But Krishna's saying you require some faith. So he tells you it's going to liberate you if you understand this. It's this amazing information. And you have to have some faith. And I don't think that's a wrong request. I mean, even as a teacher, if you try to teach somebody something and they want to object at every moment to every single thing you say, like imagine if you tried to teach me Spanish and I questioned every single thing you said. Then you showed me a book. I question the book. I question your pronunciation. I question your use of language, whether it was colloquially astute or not, whether it's the way Spanish is being spoken currently in Mexico, or whether it was dated, whether you spoke with an American accent, or whether you were actually speaking proper Spanish with a Mexican accent. Imagine if I just made it my business to make your life miserable and object at every moment to every single thing you said to me. Could you teach me Spanish? The answer is no. You'd have to qualify everything, and then qualify that, and then qualify that, and then prove that, and then prove that, and prove that. It would just go on forever. Some willingness, some openness, some receptivity. And so when Krishna says you have to have faith, I don't believe that that's some sort of fundamentalist position, that's some sort of unreasonable position. I think that's actually the way the world goes around. It's the way you go to college. It's the way you learn how to cook. It's the way you learn how to speak a language. It's the way you learn how to do anything. And that was my attempt to explain my logic, troubleshoot it, point out why it's a reasonable request, trace out the history of where faith went wrong in Western thought, why faith is this evil thing when it didn't used to be, how faith got separated from logic, how mind got separated from body, and kind of flesh it out for you guys. And then Krishna explains panentheism. That everything is within him and he's beyond everything. And he gives a great analogy, the analogy of space and wind. How wind exists within space, but is simultaneously aloof from space. And space exists as an accommodating principle that sustains things like wind and molecules and air and oxygen, but is not necessarily inexorably linked to those things and can exist independent of those things. And so Krishna explains his immanence and his transcendence, how he's everywhere, but at the same time beyond this world. And he gives you a very sophisticated understanding of theology, which is surprising because he's able to do it with really simple nature examples. Like I put out an Instagram reel today about the trolley experiment. So the trolley experiment, they came up with it over 100 years ago. And it's used to teach different types of ethical theories. It primarily teaches you two types of ethical theories, but if you get into it enough, it teaches kind of all four types of ethical theories, the four primary types. So the main two types of ethical theories that are dealt with in the trolley experiment are consequentialism and deontology, which in simple language, it's get good results. Get good results. A results-based ethic. The ends justifies the means. You can do anything provided you get a good result. It's also sometimes called utilitarianism. It has two flavors, hedonistic utilitarianism and negative utilitarianism. It doesn't, like these terms are sort of unnecessary. It's just real simple. Either you want to make yourself, that would be selfish, or other people happy. That's hedonic utilitarianism, where you're trying to increase pleasure. Or you want to minimize suffering, either again for yourself or for others, and it's either a personal negative utilitarianism or a global negative utilitarianism. So you're trying to minimize suffering or increase pleasure, and whatever gets you to that goal is moral. So the ends, what you achieve, always justifies the means. You follow? The other major competing theory is what would be called a duty-based ethic, or an acts, A-C-T-S, acts-based ethic. And that's the opposite of consequentialism. That is, do the right thing and don't worry about the result. Do the right thing and don't worry about the result. So one is a duty-based ethic. Figure out what your duty is, figure out what your code is, and do that, and don't worry about the result. The other one is a results-based ethic. Do whatever gets you the result you want. And they go by a number of different names, but those are the core concepts. So the trolley experiment is 5 people are about to get run over by a train. You can't save them. But you can pull a lever. If you pull the lever, the train will be diverted to another track. On the other track, there's one person. Do you pull the lever? Save 5 people, kills 1 person. Do you pull the lever? Raise your hand if you pull the lever. A lot of people pull the lever. Like more than 50% of the people tested, out of the millions of people who have been tested for a century and like 120 years, pull the lever. Understand that if you pull the lever, you're now murdering somebody. You're not murdering those 5 people. They were already getting killed. You had nothing to do with it. But by pulling that lever, this innocent guy over here who wasn't going to die is now going to die. You're playing God. If you are a results-based ethicist, that's fine. You're comfortable with that. Okay, I'll murder that guy to save these 5. Yes. There was another experiment where a bomb was going. You could redirect the bomb to go to a less populated area. Will you do that? Yeah, but you just murdered those people in that less populated area. But for a results-based ethicist, that works. You follow? Now, for a duty-based ethicist, I'm not going to interfere. I'd be a murderer. I don't want those people to die, but I'm not going to murder this guy to save them. I can't do that. That's like, I'm not going to touch that. You could make it sexy. It must be their karma or something like that. You could try to do that. Shake a little karma on there to sound cool. But if you boil it down, what it really is, in its core is, I'm not going to commit murder. You follow? I'm not going to do this. People hate this experiment too because it's like macabre and it's a rough experiment. It forces you to make decisions that you don't normally encounter in real life. There's any number of critiques of this trolley experiment, but it's been around for 120 years, and people use it in colleges all over the world to teach ethics. And they mess around with it. They play around with it. There's the fat man version. That's what they call it. I make it up. They call it the fat man version. Although, now today's culture of fat shaming, they probably got to rewrite that. They came up with it in the 70s. It's probably not the right play. But anyway, in the large individual, fat man, I got to drop both, right? Why is he just a fat person? And so in the large individual version of this, you're on a bridge. The train's going to hit 5 people, but there's a dude on the bridge sitting there, and if you push him off the bridge, the train will run into him, and he's so big that it'll make the train stop and it'll save the 5 people. You follow this? Would you do that? Nobody would do that. But how's that different than pulling the lever? It's the same thing. You're murdering somebody. One's just a little more up close and personal. You follow? Like a gun, if you're going to shoot somebody with a gun, don't ask me how I know this stuff. If you're going to shoot somebody with a gun, you step away from the person. It's not an intimate weapon. You put distance between yourself. If somebody's got a gun on you and they step back, it means they're about to shoot you. There's all sorts of things people do. You know they're going to attack you. If somebody's looking at you and they're talking to you and they start speaking to you in monosyllabic language, then you know they're getting ready to punch you. They're turning off their thinking brain and they're switching into attack mode. And so you know they're about to hit you. When the conversation stops, you start seeing the guy nod at you and kind of lulling you, and he's closing the distance, then you know an attack is imminent. Somebody's holding a gun on you and they step backwards, they're going to shoot you. A knife's the opposite. A knife's an intimate instrument of violence. It's up close and personal. When people kill other people with knives, it's usually like a crime of passion. There's a lot of anger. So, we're comfortable pulling a lever, but we're not comfortable pushing somebody off a bridge. Then they had the fat villain version. Now the guy's a mass murderer sitting on the bridge. He's a mass murderer. You follow? Would you push him off? Maybe, right? You can play with it any way you want to. You follow? There's a million ways to do it, right? Now that one person, the 5 gets saved, but the 1 gets killed, that one's your son. Now you do it? The 5 of your family members, the 1 person you don't know. Now you do it? You knock one train into another, they fall off the train tracks, right? And they save the people, but there might be somebody down there that they run into, you don't know. The train's on a loop. You don't actually divert the track, but the train's on a loop, and if you put one person in front of it, it'll loop around and come back. So you divert it, it comes around, it loops around, and so you kill this one person, but it gives you time to try to save these 5 people. Interestingly enough, a lot of people who wouldn't pull the lever, if it's a loop, they'll pull the lever. Because they feel like they're like not just sacrificing one for the other, but they're part of like a plan to like save these people, and they like have to be involved in it. And so it makes it like sting a little less. And so these are different ways to teach people ethics, to get people thinking about this stuff. Of course, like Marcus Aurelius said, stop talking about what a good person is and just start being one. The thing is, you have to actually think about what a good person is so that you can then choose to live like a good person. So whether you like this particular thought experiment, it's called the trolley experiment, popularized by somebody in the 70s, based on an older model in the 60s, but ultimately goes back over a century. There's a lady in the 70s who kind of made it in its most popular form. And people are messing with it. There's a whole organ transplant thing where like you're a doctor and then there's 5 people who are going to die if they don't get an organ transplant, but then a healthy person comes in and you could kill them and harvest their 5 organs and save 5 lives. Do you do it? And no one would ever know? How's that different than pulling the lever and killing somebody? You know? And so there's all sorts of like little variations on this argument they've made over the decades. Halfway through, I remembered where I was in my tangent, but I lost it. Krishna brilliantly comes up with a simple example of space versus oxygen, space versus molecules. A brilliant argument. And that argument fully communicates what he wants to teach as nicely today as it did thousands of years ago when it was given. You could contrast that to something as simple as the trolley experiment and how many variations it's undergone in 100 years to try to teach its lesson. By the way, the other two major theories of ethics are virtue ethics and pragmatic ethics. Pragmatic ethics would be an ethical approach which is adopted, bracketed in a certain frame. It's kind of an instrumentalist approach. There's no absolute standard of right or wrong, but rather in a given circumstance you adopt a set of morals that make sense for that time and that place. And those ethics can be temporary. They don't need to be universal. They don't need to be true for all time. You're not necessarily dealing with absolute reality, but it works pragmatically in a given circumstance. That's a pragmatic ethic. And then there's a virtue ethic, which is the Greeks were all about this. They introduced this thing called virtue. And virtue helps you decide what you should do in a given time and circumstance. I like virtue ethics. It's painful because you have to define what virtue is, and you have to do it rigorously. But once you've done that, once you've gone through that trouble, you now have a principle which will help you move through and navigate life and make the best decision in any circumstance you're in. It has all the benefits of the pragmatic ethic, which allows you to float and do different things, but it also has the benefit of an absolute ethic. And the real absolute ethic is deontological ethic. It's a duty-based ethic. It's true for all time and all places. Immanuel Kant is famous for deontology. He really explored it in detail in Western thought. The Gita teaches a duty-based ethic. And so I like the absolute nature of deontology, and virtue gives you something absolute. But then it also gives you the flexibility to adjust, because I could see the value in a results-based approach or in a duty-based approach, depending on the circumstance. If a murderer was to walk in here and say, "Tell me where Narayan is, because I'm going to kill him," I wouldn't be like, "There's Narayan," because I never tell lies. You follow? At the same time, I value honesty. So I need to have an ethic which allows me to navigate. It's troublesome. It's painful. You might become hypocritical, inventing ethics to suit your whims and your wants. But if you do your work right, a duty-based ethic has this incredible degree of flexibility combined with a high degree of absoluteness and universality, provided you do a good job of figuring out what are virtues, how to cultivate them, and what they look like. And then you can use them to adjudicate, almost like you would use a set of instruments to deal with any circumstance you're presented with. The Gita really teaches a duty-based ethic mixed with virtue, and that virtue really being surrender to divinity. If you want to know my thoughts on the Gita's model of ethics. Anyway, it's very impressive that Krishna was able to, so many millennia ago, come up with a very easy way through a nature example, without microscopes or fancy stuff that has to be redone every couple of decades to keep it relevant. He was able to come up with an excellent example to teach what he's trying to communicate, namely that he's in charge of the world, but at the same time aloof. Again, if Krishna's too involved in the world, he gets responsible for all the bad that happens. If he's too removed from the world, then there's no value in taking shelter of him. And also, a deity that was too removed from the world would all of a sudden become cruel. A deity should be involved in the world as much as he possibly could be in a way that didn't affect your free will. That would be the best of all deities. Do you follow this? Okay. So then Krishna explains really that there's two ways of dealing with them. And this is text 12. That was all because I want to bring up text 12. Remember at the beginning I was like, Text 12, but I thought, you know what, to get them to where they can really appreciate this, we got to go back a little bit. So now text 12 says, you see the last three words, Prakritim Mohinim Ashritaha? You see that? They've taken shelter of the bewildering energy. Prakriti means energy, nature. Now, who's ultimately in charge of that nature that bewilders them? Krishna. You follow? Now look at the next verse. You see the first line, second half, Daivim Prakritim Ashritaha? You see that? Text 13, first line, second half. They've taken shelter of my transcendental energy. So what you're left with here is there's basically two ways to interface with Krishna in this world. You either turn towards him and you're sheltered by his divine energy. Daivim is where you get the word divine from in English. Or you turn away from Krishna and you take shelter of illusion. Either way, our fundamental constituency, our fundamental constitution, is that we are sheltered by Krishna. Being the Lord, being the creator of the cosmos, being the creator of everything, we're always interfacing with Krishna at every moment. So it really becomes a question of how you want to interface, how you want to surrender to Krishna, how you want to take shelter of Krishna. You can either do so indirectly, but this idea like I want to truly turn away from God, how would that be possible? If God's truly everywhere in all things, how could you ever really turn away from God? What you could do is you could indirectly interface with God. You could ignore God while he's all around you. You follow? And to do that means you're bewildered because you're not seeing reality for what it is. If God actually exists, to not see God's existence is to be illusioned. You're missing out. Like imagine if, Albert's in the room, Alberto's in the room. So if somebody goes, I don't see Alberto. I'm like, he's right there. Like, I don't see anybody. Like he's in the green shirt with the black mask. You're like, don't see anything. Like a mean girl, right? Like, I don't see anybody. What are you talking about? So there's no way to get around the reality that Alberto is right there. Well, we could leave the room, but in God's case, you can't because God's actually the substratum of the entire existence. So how do you truly turn away from God? Well, you don't. You take shelter of God indirectly. You use God's help to ignore him. You fall into illusion because that's your free will. If God didn't give you that option, then you wouldn't really have free will. And so it's interesting that in these two verses, the basic conundrum or dilemma of the soul is there. You have problems. Problems are more navigable than dilemmas. In a situation with a dilemma, you have two choices, either one of which has bad results. In jiu-jitsu, ideally, you want to give your opponent dilemmas, where if they move one way, they move into a submission hold. And if they move another way, they move into a submission hold. And you're really giving them two choices, either one of which finishes them. You can create problems for people, and they keep solving your problems you create with them. Keep getting out of stuff. Keep worming their way out of stuff. But when you have a dilemma, you have to choose one of two paths. You follow? And you see that kind of dilemma right here. You're going to interface with Krishna somehow, either through illusion or directly. And those people who choose to interface with Krishna directly, they turn towards Krishna. What do? They chant my glory. Satatam, which means always. Kirtayantaha. They do kirtan. Satatam kirtayanto mam. They do kirtan about me all the time. It's pretty cool, right? It's right there in the Gita. As the basic feature of those people who worship Krishna, bhajanti. Bhajanti means they do bhakti, they worship me. Ananya manasa, with their mind thinking of nothing else. They're just worshiping me. Sheltered by my divine energy. Who are those people? They're Mahatmas. Mahatmanas tumam parta. Gyatva bhutadim avyam. It's an interesting verse. It says, after they've understood me to be the origin of all beings. There's this saying, to know him is to love him. There's this idea that knowledge is a prerequisite for love. Knowledge is a prerequisite for love. I'm going to do a little fancy footwork here. So listen up. If you've been ignoring me for if you've been ignoring me the whole time, it won't sound like fancy footwork. But if you've been kind of half paying attention, here we go. Gyatva mam, having known me, bhutadim avyayam, to be the inexhaustible origin of all beings. Bhajanti ananya manasa, they worship me with an undeviating mind. Daivim prakritim ashrita, taking shelter of my divine energy. Mahatmanas tumam parta, those Mahatmas worship me like this. Satatam kirtayanto mam. They do kirtan of me always. That's how they worship me. It's interesting, but here Krishna is saying that understanding him as the divine, having learned what's taught in this chapter, the natural result of understanding how God is everywhere in all things and beyond this world. And that you have two basic choices. The result of having understood that, when people really get that and they really see reality, the result of that knowledge is that they turn towards Krishna favorably. You follow? In the same way that you have to first think about what makes somebody moral before you can really start to in earnest practice morality. Thought precedes action. There might be exceptions when we're talking about gross instincts and autonomic responses. But when we're talking about something beyond the level of a reflex, thought precedes action. Therefore, taking the trouble to stop and think about the nature of reality has incredible value. Because doing that will give you strength and fuel so that you can do the right thing. This is why the chapter focuses on knowledge before it focuses on devotion. This is why faith doesn't mean you give up reason. This is why logos is compatible with theos. What the Gita is after is teaching you something which will result in you becoming devoted and faithful. There might be an initial level of faith that's required to do the experiment, but the result of that experiment is you actually surrender and love God, because to know him is to love him, because knowledge precedes action, because you have to think about the trolley experiment before you can start to think about what your personal ethic is and start to refine it. You have to go through this stuff. Then you can start to try to live by it. Oh, I fell in love with him on first sight. Well, first of all, seeing someone is knowledge. It's totally superficial, but it's still knowledge. So you're just saying you're a superficial person, and the knowledge you require to fall in love with somebody, if it even qualifies as love, is just what you see. That makes sense? I love all beings. Yeah, because you have this deep philosophical knowledge that all beings are lovable, that all beings are spiritual, that all beings have value. So you have a high level of knowledge, and therefore you can love all beings even without meeting them. You still have knowledge. Knowledge precedes action. Knowledge precedes love. Therefore, good spirituality leads you down the road of acquiring knowledge. And that's why Krishna says, after they've understood me, then they surrender to me. They worship me. There might have been an initial level of faith that was required to get in the laboratory. But by this point, the experiment's been done. You've been fed. That knowledge exists within you. And it's actually functional in the sense that you can use it. One of the amazing things about jiu-jitsu is it's the closest thing that you've ever seen to a Chinese martial arts film. Like in a Chinese martial arts film, there's some small, skinny dude who just is able to overpower. Like, I don't know if you guys grew up watching Chinese martial arts movies. I did. So there's some small, skinny dude who's able to just overpower people 8 times his size. There's 50 of them. And he's able to do these almost it's like magic, because they do they have the whole wire thing that we don't have in Western. It's like it's a new thing. Like Western, it's an incredibly developed type of stunt choreography that was done in China for decades. And just now, in the last couple of decades, they brought it into Western films. It's required Western stuntmen to learn a whole new way of moving in the world, because they attach them to wires, which allows them to do ridiculous, impossible gymnastics. There's a few movies, House of the something Daggers and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon was a preceding film. And so there was a few of them like this that got really big, money got put behind them, and they got incredibly popular in the West, blockbuster movies. And that was when that stuff really got popularized. And so I think Quentin Tarantino also had something to do with it. Anyway, and now Jackie Chan's popularity. I'm thinking about there's a whole thing going on. There's Jackie Chan, there's the other guy with Jet Li. There's a few guys like this. But Jet Li was actually more of a traditional martial artist. Jackie Chan did the wire stuff. It's actually magic what they did, because they would be up on a wire and they go up in the air and spin around like 87 times. And it's like it was actually like on wires. It was impossible. Jiu-jitsu's like that. You know something, and then you fight against somebody bigger than you. And just because you know something they don't know, you're able to slip out from behind them and flank them and strangle them and defeat them and isolate a limb and use your legs and your hips to put pressure on their arms. No matter how strong they are, their arm is going to be weaker than your hips. And so you're able to position yourself in a way where you're able to use the strongest parts of your body against the weakest parts of their body. And the results are that these small, skinny, weak guys are able to defeat people who in no universe should they be able to defeat. They're not faster and they're not stronger, and they're just in possession of knowledge. Even boxing's not like that. You look at like a Floyd Mayweather who fights guys who are bigger than him. His timing and his speed was impeccable. You could see that his speed made him like the Flash or something like that. But with jiu-jitsu, you got like slow, oafy, kind of not so in shape Brazilian guys, and they're just crushing everybody. And then people learned jiu-jitsu, and then it was over. Then it was the playing field was leveled. You follow? This is like this. This is the real magic. It's like magic. You understand Krishna. You think about the nature of divinity. You think about the nature of the world. You use these examples to create thought experiments. You think about the logic behind believing in divinity. You challenge yourself. You work with it. And at a certain point, you know Krishna exists. You don't have any doubts anymore. And you live in a different world. All of a sudden, like this alternate dimension to reality opens up, and you live in a different world where you're close to Krishna at all times, where you can see Krishna, where you experience communion with divinity, where it changes your life, where you can navigate the world in a way you never could before, where you find meaning where no one else can, where you find purpose where no one else can, where you can communicate to other people and show them, and then they can become like you. And so having understood me, they worship me. They do kirtan. Yatantas cha dridha brataha. They strive towards me with great vows. Namasyantas cha mam bhaktya. They offer their respects to me with bhakti. Like we say namaste, this is namasyantas. It means namasyantaha. It means they offer their namaskar. They offer their respects. Namaha means respect or obeisance from nam. And so namayanta is a third person, plural, present tense. they offer their respects to me. Nitya yukta upasate. They worship me, always yoga to me. I didn't even get a chance to give class today. We went back and did the whole first part of the chapter again. I felt like we needed to put it together nicely. So we did that. And I think we're out of time. And so if you're joining us on Instagram, thank you very much for participating in the discussion. And if you guys are on Facebook and Zoom, you can hold on a minute.